Developers are going to move on to 22 notation. But to start off the 22 notation, which is going to be talking about bracket notation, I want to go back into the 21 properties file because I want to grab the whole object that we were working with over here. So I'm grabbing the address object. I'm going to grab the address object and the home object. And I'm going to bring it over here into the place where we write our JavaScript. I don't need this extra variable. So let me now open up our little live server so we can see where we're at. And what we're going to talk about now is something called bracket notation. What is bracket notation? It sounds a little bit like dot notation. Yes, correct. So bracket notation is different than dot notation. Let's review a little bit what dot notation is. And I'm going to open up my console so I can see my console logs. For me to access a property on an object, I have two options. The first option that we've talked about is to say here using dot, I want to access the property log, which happens to be a function. I use dot notation, console.log. Log is a property of the console that happens to be a function. So it is a function of the object called console. And for me to access this object called log, I have to use dot notation to get at it, right? Because log lives within the console object. Similarly, if I want to access the owner property of the home object, I must reference the home object and then use the dot owner, right? Owner is the property. It is the property of the object called home. Log is a function property. It is a function of the console object. And so between these two, we're using the dot notation to drill down into the object. And so the natural output here is that we're seeing Gregorio being output because the value within owner is being passed into as an argument to the function log. So there's the log object. There's Gregorio. All right, I click here in the developer tools and I get brought over to the same line. It gets highlighted. This is the line that generated that particular console log. Now, live here, I can access using dot notation again. Home dot owner. There's Gregorio. I can directly access the object called address. Here's address, and if I want to see the address dot ID, I use dot notation to get at ID. Okay, and then one more time, address dot street. Good. And I get access to the address.street. Now, how can I do this with bracket notation? What does bracket notation mean? What bracket notation means is, like, let's come back over here. I'm going to use home. I'm going to leave an example of one with dot and one with bracket notation. So here's a home object. I want to access the property owner. Instead of using dots, I'm going to use the square brackets. And now the square brackets, you must pass a string. So the string that I'm choosing to pass here is owner. Why have I chosen this particular string owner is because that is the name of the property. All right. So let me give this guy a little space so you can see him. Home is the name of the object. And the property within home that we want to access is called owner. And using bracket notation, we surround the property with square brackets and quotes. So once I hit save, it does a little auto formatting for me. And on the right hand side, we can see that we have two console logs using the dot notation and using the bracket notation. In any way, this is valid for the address. So I can do the same thing for the address. If I wanted to say I want to access the address object. And let me comment these two out. So if I were to make a mistake, for example, and I'm going to go after the address object, and I pick, actually, let me pick the first one that makes sense. So street. So here comes street. And it's going to get logged out as 100 Main Street over here. Again, if I wanted to see this live in the console in the command line here, I can just copy paste that and hit enter. Important thing that you should note that if you misspell this, right? So there I am misspelling it. There is no property called street. There is no property called street. So you get undefined. If you misspell it, and this is probably the more frustrating misspelling, is because, yes, that still says street. But JavaScript is case sensitive, so you get undefined. And this is the type of error that might drive you really bananas and crazy. Let me zoom for this and make sure I'm not blocking you. The address object, let's look at it raw. And let's bring it up actually to the top. All right, we can actually see it here in the graph. And we'll look at it here in the console. The address object has 3 properties. All of these are, again, lowercase because there's no need for camel casing at this point. There's no other words embedded in the properties. If I want to access the address.street, I type it out using dot notation like this. Or I have to reference it with the lowercase s using bracket notation. Again, doing dot notation, if I would have misspelled this with a capital S, I get undefined. So case sensitive, it's very case sensitive. Just like as if I would have called it address and maybe put a capital at the end, that's, address is not defined. This one actually throws an error because of a slightly different the context in which it's executing. Now, again, whether I misspell it with a capital at the beginning or end, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't matter. What matters is that it has to be completely case sensitive. Everything needs to match exactly. And once I have the address object correctly identified, I get to, and then again, using your IntelliSense, you can see here that I have a set of properties, a set of values that the browser, that the tools that we work with are trying to give me a hint. They're trying to help me out. I can do ID. And there's my ID. Notice that there I get a little preview before I even hit enter. There is my ID. So that's bracket notation. All right. Now, just like we did in dot notation, I can type home, and then I can type mailing address, and then I can click dot ID. Right. So now you can see here I have 2 dots. I have 2 dots. If I wanted to grab those 2 dots, right, let me grab this variable. And I say var, my address ID is this. If I do that, and I come back and visualize it in my object graph, we'll see that, yes, my address ID got pulled out. And it is no longer connected to this particular property called ID that lives inside of this object that we refer to either as a mailing address or as an address. So that's what that looks like in written code for us to look at, right? So that's what, there it is right there. All right, so now I just used 2 dots to drill down progressively into an object that was inside, right? Inside of another object. I can do this in multiple layers. Here comes a mailing address, right? The mailing address is an object. Here's that object. Wonderful. And again, without using dot notation, I can still access the properties of this object using bracket notation. Here comes the brackets, right? And now I want to see the apartment. Oh, mailing address, apartment is null. That's correct. Let's not, I had a moment there. The apartment is null. What I want to see is the ID. All right. So that works out well using the bracket notation. That's what that would look like. One bracket after another. Now, this syntax feels a little bit more complicated potentially to wrap your heads around, right? If it does feel a little bit more complicated, that's fine. No need to panic. No, you don't have to learn every little bit of different way of accessing and doing the same thing. You can settle in on something that makes you feel more comfortable. This might be more comfortable. So you can see both of these IDs point to that same object. Now let's use Alias. I'm going to use just because this is the name that came to me. I want to use this alias to point to home. Oh, I want it to use the home mailing address. So this points to an object, right? This is the object, mailing address. Here's mailing address. It's the object here called 100 Main Street with an ID of the 558-55978. So this is that object. It is currently pointed to by address, and it's currently pointed to by mailing address. If I create this alias using the bracket notation, it's just as good, right? See this alias? Here's my little pointer for my alias. Here it is. And there's my little pointer for my address. And there is the mailing address pointing to the same object. So regardless if I use bracket notation or dot notation, I can create a variable that will use and share. Well, it doesn't share the pointer. It simply has a pointer to the same object. There's my same object. Now it's pointed to by this variable, and it's pointed to by the property here that is first accessible through home. Okay, and so I wanted to point that out, that I don't have to use dot notation to grab a reference to that object in the same way that I did, dot notation. I can use bracket notation just as fine. And that's pretty much the main purpose of bracket. No, the main purpose of bracket notation. Let me show you actually. That's the syntax. Now, why would I want to do that? Why would I want to use square bracket notation? You got to type a little bit more. Maybe it looks less pleasing to the eye. The reason why you would want to do that, and let's try to clean up this area here by saying, is let's just say my target property is going to be actually mailing address, right? Or let's say selected address, right? So it's a mailing address. And what I'm going to do here right now is, I see how this guy's got a mailing address. I'm also going to give him an empty object for shipping address. Okay, and just because I want to have this guy have some type of street, what do I want to put? Let's go put him at 400 corporate. So we have this variable called select. I want to call it actually selected. So here's going to be our selected address. It's just a string. I have this alias. Let me clean up. I want to clean up this graph a little bit. And I think that's going to be better right there. Let's see. All right, so that's a little bit better. I don't need this other ID there. I want to clean this up. All right, so we're going to render now with a mailing address that's simply a string. And now our home object, for some reason, has two addresses. Maybe I don't want stuff shipped to my house. I want to go pick it up at the post office. Here's my name, and I have two separate addresses. If I were to selected address, is a variable, and so now var target. This is the target now. I want to set up a target. Which address am I targeting? I'm not going to know this ahead of time because potentially I want to leave this up to the user. And so the user is going to select by some mechanism which address they want me to pick. And when they pick a specific address, I'm going to be able to capture it in a variable. So here I am simulating the fact that they are going to pick the mailing address. And I've put that option and I've put that value now in a variable called selected address. Because bracket notation takes a string, I can now leverage the fact that I have a string as a variable and pass it into the home object using bracket notation. And that allows me to dynamically access a property on the home object, right? It could be mailing address, it could be shipping address, it turns out that right now the target is going to point to, and notice here, it points to this object called 100 Main Street, because I've said I want to go to the mailing address, and the home object's mailing address is pointed to by this object, right? Now, notice how the shipping address only has one pointer to it because it's only defined within here. There is no other pointer set out outside. All right, so dynamically, I have picked mailing address to be my target. Later on, if I really wanted to change it, I could simply, the user selects another variable from some type of interface, a drop down, a checkbox. And now we said that the selected address is going to be the shipping address. Therefore, the variable that I have declared as target is going to be assigned the expression that we have here. And this expression is using bracket notation to drill down into the object called home. It drills down into this object called home and uses the string which holds the value of shipping address, right? Shipping address. It picks the shipping address out of the home object, and it basically says, hey, copy and make a pointer over to this address that is 400 corporate. That is the cool thing about bracket notation. What do you do when you don't know what you want to access, right? You don't know the name of the property ahead of time. How do you access an object? How do you access these properties if you don't know them ahead of time? You can use the variables, right? Now, let me point something out in case it's not clear. If I were to try to say, right, the variable name is selected address. Ooh, that's zoomed in here. Let me go in here. So the variable name is selected address. So there it is. Selected address has shipping address. If I say home.selectedAddress, it doesn't work because home does not have a property called selected address, right? When it only has these three properties: mailing address, shipping address, and owner. So when I type home, if I literally type out selected address like I did before, it is going to look for an object literally called selected address. That doesn't work. There's no such property. So we need to have a way to dynamically do that. And the way that we dynamically do that is we leverage the fact that this selected address is a string. Selected address is a string. Since selected address is a string, we can use it as a part of bracket notation, and we provide that as the argument here. No quotes necessary because it is a variable, and we hit enter, and there it is. That is the object in question. Okay, so that is a that's going to really conclude the usage of bracket notation. Before you move on, play with this a little bit here, either in the editor over here on the left in VS Code, or out of the console in your browser. But don't feel compelled to have to use this. This comes up often, where you have to do that when you start building more dynamic stuff, because the dynamic capabilities that this affords you is really good. So you end up going to it. Cool. But you don't have to use it unless you have to. All right. So if you feel comfortable with dot notation, just stick to dot notation. Dot notation is definitely a winner.